I was embarrassed for Shasheen. She wasn't able to say what she intended to say.
Marlon Brando, the legendary godfather who once drove millions of women crazy, had only shown the world the tip of the iceberg. Behind that dazzling facade lay a life steeped in darkness, haunted by obsessions and scandals so notorious that even Hollywood hesitated to speak of them. In 2004, Brando passed away in agonizing pain. Beneath his deathbed, a handwritten note was discovered that sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry, a list of same-sex lovers he had been involved with. This revelation exposed a tangled web of overlapping relationships that kept Brando in constant emotional turmoil. In one particularly disturbing case, he even turned another famous celebrity into a slave in a toxic, manipulative S&M relationship. Who were the names on that explosive list? And who was the one that drove Hollywood's ultimate bad boy to the point of wanting to keep their ashes after death? Brando was born into a broken family. His father was a strict, violent, and abusive man, while his mother, the talented actress Dorothy, was a heavy alcoholic who neglected her children to chase after a lover. His childhood was devoid of laughter, filled instead with alcohol fumes, shouting matches, beatings, and the suffocating darkness of addiction. One of the most shocking revelations about Brando's life occurred when he was just 4 years old. His 18-year-old maid named Hermie, hired to take care of him, became what he would later describe as his first lover. Few could imagine a child so young having such an experience. The image of Hermie haunted Brando for the rest of his life, fueling his attraction to dark-skinned women, Asian women, and Jewish women, all of whom reminded him in some way of Hermie. Brando suffered from sexual addiction, but not in the usual sense of lust. He once admitted to being in love and sleeping with 4 or 5 people at the same time. He knew it caused pain to others, yet he was powerless to stop. The fear of abandonment, rooted in his mother's departure and his early experience with Hermie, was deeply ingrained in his psyche, turning into a lifelong obsession. It was a desperate attempt to escape loneliness, to feel loved, and to fill the emptiness within. His youth was defined by rebellion. In school, he skipped classes constantly. When caught placing a homemade bomb in a teacher's room, he was expelled. Enraged, his father sent him to Shattuck Military Academy in hopes of straightening him out. But for Brando, the school's rigid discipline was hell, clashing completely with his wild nature. He ran away several times, was caught twice, and was eventually expelled for good. It was these harsh twists of fate that pushed Brando toward the stage. In New York, he met Stella Adler, the woman who transformed him into an acting icon. Just a few years later, Brando became a storm that swept away all conventional acting standards. Then came Last Tango in Paris, a film banned in many countries for its explicit scenes, with some alleging that one particular scene involved actual sexual assault. The scene between Brando and actress Maria Schneider remains controversial to this day. As those involved later revealed, they were not informed beforehand. Despite a career filled with cinematic masterpieces such as The Godfather on the Waterfront and Apocalypse. Now Brando once confessed, "I have never been happy." He publicly admitted to having 9 lovers, though the real number was far higher. And they weren't all women. Brando also had intimate relationships with men. "If I love a man so," what he once said, "we're human beings, not labels." So who exactly were the names on his secret lovers list? You might be shocked to discover that they weren't strangers at all, but some of the most legendary figures in Hollywood. 1. James Dean, the fool who fell for Hollywood's beast in a twisted love affair. James Dean was the very first name to appear on Marlon Brando's list of lovers. What shocked the public was that their relationship was not a romantic love story, but a cruel game of cat and mouse. Brando played the role of the dominant, while Dean, outwardly defiant yet broken inside, became an easy prey to be crushed. According to the book James Dean Tomorrow Never Comes, 2016, author Stanley Haggart revealed that their relationship carried strong elements of psychological S&M. Brando would make Dean wait outside his door for hours in humiliation while he was inside with someone else. He even burned cigarette butts into Dean's skin as a way to assert dominance, manipulating the young actor's emotions like a puppet. Brando treated Jimmy like a game. For his amusement, Haggart wrote a pastime to kill time. Even in pain, Dean possessed a strange allure, transforming his suffering into something beautiful, much like the roles he portrayed on screen, rebellious yet fragile. In real life, Dean lived a quiet existence, immersing himself in photography, caring for animals, loving classical music, and indulging in philosophy. On some nights, he would sit in the hallway outside Brando's apartment, shivering from intoxication, knocking on the door, but never getting an answer. To Brando, Dean was a pitiable figure, willing to endure any humiliation just to be close to his idol. In the legendary interview, The Duke in His Domain, Truman Capote recorded Brando's cold words, "Dean was never my friend. I hardly knew him. But he was obsessed with me. Everything I did, he copied. He kept trying to call me, leaving messages, but I never called him back." Some accounts claim Dean idolized Brando to the point of mimicking his acting style, his fashion, even his smallest habits. The more Brando sensed this desperate attachment, something he inherently despised, the more contempt he felt. He was just a kid who broke his toys and cried when he cut his hand, Brando once said bitterly. Yet the truth was that Brando needed Dean, needed a mirror image of himself, a younger, more fragile version, someone he could both despise and secretly compare himself to. Whenever he saw Dean drunk and writhing from childhood wounds or broken love affairs, Brando felt an itch deep inside. Why can't you swallow your pain like a man? In 1955, James Dean died suddenly in a horrific car crash in his Porsche 550 Spider, nicknamed Little Bastard. He was just 24 years old, leaving behind only 3 films, yet becoming the first actor in history to receive a posthumous Oscar nomination. Years later, when asked about Dean, Brando's voice grew quiet. He was a fool. But I sometimes think about him. As for Brando, he went on living recklessly, destroying relationships, but perhaps never again finding someone who loved him with the same blind devotion as Dean. Rumor has it that when Brando died in 2004, there was still a photograph of Dean taken in 1954, with a radiant smile in his final room. But James Dean was not the only person who haunted Brando for a lifetime. There was another, awkward and quiet, whose memory left such a deep mark that Brando carried their ashes with him for over 3 decades. 2. Wally Cox, a youthful love and the ashes that shocked Hollywood. Marlon Brando and Wally Cox first met in Evanston, Illinois, when they were both students at Libertyville High School in the 1930s. Wally Cox, small in stature, quick-witted with a sly, sarcastic smile, was the opposite of Brando, who was brooding and frequently skipped classes. While most people mocked Brando, Cox saw something entirely different in him. And Brando, lost in the confusion of adolescence, found in Cox a listener full of patience and compassion. When Brando's father berated him so fiercely that he smashed his bedroom door, Cox was the only one who knew. Brando cried. And when Cox felt out of place in a world that idolized hyper-masculinity, Brando told him, "You're smarter than they are, and I need you to exist." They grew up together, lived under the same roof, and later left Illinois for New York in the 1940s to chase their dreams. But the bond between Brando and Cox was never confined to friendship. It was a love without sex. A profound connection, blending admiration, protection, emotional dependence, and deep spiritual understanding. Brando once said, If Wally had been a woman, I would have married him, and we would have lived happily ever after. According to writer Beauregard Houston Montgomery, Brando admitted Cox was the greatest love of his life. Though Brando had slept with hundreds of people, he never touched Cox. In one of his final interviews, he stated plainly, "Sex is overrated. The most beautiful intimacy I've ever had was with Wally. We didn't need to touch." In 1973, Wally Cox died suddenly of a heart attack, and Brando collapsed like a child. He didn't cry in front of cameras, nor did he attend the funeral. But the truly unsettling part was yet to come. Brando kept Cox's ashes in his home for over 30 years, carrying them everywhere, from film sets to hotels to his private estate, as if afraid to let them out of his sight. Every night he would speak to the urn as if it were a sleeping lover, placing it beside Cox's favorite novels. A close friend recalled, no one was allowed to touch that urn. If you reached for it, he'd go mad. He'd say, "He's still here, every day." He often muttered to himself, his voice heavy with melancholy, "Wally. Wally." The name echoing like a curse, like a call from some far-off place. On certain nights, Brando would stay up until dawn, staring at an old photograph of Cox, his eyes swimming with unspoken sorrow. Rumor had it that he sometimes phoned mutual friends just to ask, "Do you remember Wally's voice?" Over time, Wally Cox ceased to be just a man and became a ghost haunting Brando until the end of his days. In his lonely Mulholland Drive estate, neighbors claimed they sometimes heard Brando's raspy laughter ring out in the middle of the night like a madman's. "I lost the only person who ever understood me." When Brando died in 2004, he was not buried with his family or his ex-wives. Instead, in accordance with his wishes, his ashes were mixed with Cox's and scattered together in Death Valley, one of the most barren, wild, and desolate places in America. This was not the act of friends, but a symbol of a bond that transcended time and even death itself. And just when it seemed Brando would never love anyone else, in the same way, fate led him into the sorrowful eyes of another man, a melancholy soul with the face of an angel. 3. Montgomery Clift. When Brando fell for the broken-winged angel, for Montgomery Clift, every role was a mask. A place where he could hide from reality and shield the wounds in his soul. But fate, like a sudden stinging slap, hurled him into the orbit of someone utterly opposite Marlon Brando. Their first meeting happened on a September night in 1953, at the wrap party for From Here to Eternity. According to reporters present, Brando spotted Clift the moment he walked in, but deliberately ignored him. With a blonde starlet on his arm, he laughed loudly. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the corner of the room, where Clift stood quietly. Then Brando smirked, pushed the woman aside, and strode directly toward him. Standing squarely in front, hands on hips, head tilted slightly, as if studying some strange creature. Brando said, "I hear you're quite the actor. But why do you look so sad, like a clown who just dropped his smile?" Brando's beauty was almost suffocating. A face like a masterpiece, a sculpted physique, eyes that radiated defiance, and a free-spirited charisma that unsettled both men and women. But what truly shook people was the way he lived. A wild, boundless instinct that knew no rules. Clift could not resist that storm. Clift wanted a quiet kind of love, gentle, discreet, like a candle flickering in the night. But Brando, he lived as if burning each second to the ground, intense, reckless, never hiding behind the curtain of propriety. Clift needed peaceful arms to hold him. Brando was a fire that barged into his room unannounced. Brando dragged Clift into all-night parties, drunken sprees, and fleeting affairs with every type of person imaginable. Clift endured in silence, sinking into depression, swallowing bitterness every time Brando kissed one person and flirted with another. Years later, Brando recalled an argument between them. Clift asked Marlon, "Do I mean anything to you?" Brando smirked. "Which answer do you want? The romantic one or the truth?" Clift walked out without a word. Brando loved like a libertine. Clift loved like a devotee, suffering quietly and choking back tears whenever Brando found himself in another scandal. Unsurprisingly, the relationship lasted barely 6 months. Brando reached his peak with On the Waterfront Then, The Godfather. But that pinnacle marked the start of a long fall. Empty affairs turned him coarse and erratic. He arrived late, forgot his lines, lashed out at co-stars. From a man the world admired, Brando became a shadow of himself. So overweight that Apocalypse Now's director had to film him in ways that hid his size. As for Clift, he died young, but lived on in Brando's memory. Rumor has it Brando would sit alone replaying A Place in the Sun over and over. The film where Clift was at his most beautiful and pure, before being swept into the storm named Marlon Brando. And then one day, another gaze appeared, belonging to a man utterly unlike Clift, not fragile, not self-destructive, but strong, private, and so flawless that he seemed untouchable. 4. Paul Newman, The Silent Affair Between Two Opposite Men. In the 1940s, at the Actors Studio, two future Hollywood icons crossed paths for the first time. Paul Newman, with the flawless looks of a golden boy straight out of a soap commercial, and Marlon Brando, who always looked as though he had just walked away from a backstage brawl. At first, they didn't speak. The gap between their worlds was too wide. Brando nicknamed Newman Goldie Boy for his clean-cut, impeccably polite appearance. Newman admitted that Brando made him uneasy, describing him as a storm and saying he could smell danger coming off him. But as with so many Hollywood stories, opposites proved magnetic. Brando lived wildly and fiercely, openly, acknowledging affairs with both men and women. He once declared bluntly, "I've had homosexual experiences, and I'm not ashamed." Newman, on the other hand, was entirely different. A family man with a wife and a carefully protected ideal husband image in the media. Rumor has it that one night at an intimate Manhattan party, Brando and Newman slipped away from the crowd together. They reappeared the next morning. Brando still groggy, Newman wearing sunglasses and saying nothing. No one dared to ask. But from that day on, they began to be seen together more often at rehearsals, at private lunches, at meetings known only to them. According to writer Darwin Porter, who interviewed Brando before his death, Brando was blunt about Newman. He never fooled me. Paul Newman was just as frisky on set as the rest of us, and just as bisexual. The only difference is, while I'd get caught with my pants around my ass, he knew how to keep it hidden in the dark. In the years that followed, Brando reached his peak with The Godfather, while Newman won an Oscar for The Color of Money. They rarely spoke. Yet the press never forgot the moment at the 1973 Oscars when Newman quietly walked past Brando backstage. A stagehand later recalled Brando exploding in rage, throwing a glass of wine against the wall and shouting, "He still acts like nothing ever happened, like nothing ever existed." The media at the time chalked it up to a personal dispute. But the truth was, Brando never forgave Newman for playing the good man too perfectly. And Newman, perhaps until his dying day, he wondered whether he should have dared to live just once like Brando. Paul Newman left Brando with a lingering ache, the kind born of things that could have been. But Brando's next affair would be with someone completely different, a fiery, dangerous actor who had no need to hide anything at all. 5. Richard Pryor. If there was weed in a bed, they'd be each other. The 1970s were a time of both brilliance and darkness for Marlon Brando and Richard Pryor. Brando, having reached the pinnacle of fame with The Godfather, began to spiral into personal crises entangled in lawsuits and public scandals. Pryor, the genius of comedy, was in the wildest chapter of his life, consumed by drugs, alcohol, and fleeting affairs. Legendary producer Quincy Jones once shocked the world when asked about Brando's sex life. He'd fuck anything, a mailbox. James Baldwin, Richard Pryor, Marvin Gaye. Jennifer Lee Pryor, Richard's wife, later confirmed it. Pryor and Brando once shared a drunken night together, and Pryor never tried to hide it. Richard would laugh his ass off if he heard this being talked about, she said. He didn't see it as a scandal or anything shameful. He lived like a fire burning to the fullest, even if it was just for one night. They continued to cross paths at Hollywood parties, exchanging nods, sometimes tossing jokes back and forth. Pryor plunged deeper into booze and drugs. Brando kept running from himself through one role after another, then grew tired and retreated into solitude. Occasionally, Pryor would call Brando in the middle of the night to say something nonsensical, to ask about a new film, to talk politics, or simply to listen to the sound of his breathing on the other end. Brando rarely said much, but he always picked up. A friend of Pryor's once revealed Pryor told me Brando was the only man he ever wanted to punch in the face and hug at the same time. Brando died in 2004, Pryor in 2005. No diary entries, no public confessions ever documented their relationship. Only rumors remained, scattered fragments of memory from others. Both men died in profound loneliness despite being surrounded by millions of fans in life. Perhaps that's the fate of geniuses who never truly belong to this world. They destroy themselves, they search for salvation in each other. But in the end, they remain two wanderers on a road with no way out. And when the final stage lights went dark, all that was left was an old frail Marlon Brando sitting in a cold room haunted by ghosts and gnawed by memories. That was when the legend began to melt away. 6. Marlon Brando's final years, from money machine to dying in debt. Once he was Hollywood's money machine. A cinematic icon who commanded the screen with his deep gaze and performances that left the world breathless. But in the final chapter of his life, Marlon Brando was no longer surrounded by luxury or applause. Instead, there was loneliness, silence, and a crushing debt of $17 million, a bitter scar to mark the end of a legend. It's hard to imagine that the man who once shook Hollywood ended up relying on government assistance in his later years. After 3 failed marriages and countless affairs, Brando had at least 12 children, both biological and adopted. But he never had a complete family. Only children who bore his name scattered in different directions, each carrying a part of his legacy and tragedy. His eldest son, Christian Brando, was convicted of manslaughter in 1990 after shooting his sister Cheyenne's boyfriend. The case shocked the world, not just for its violence, but because it unfolded in a family once seen as powerful and legendary. Cheyenne, beautiful yet deeply troubled, battled mental illness, haunted by a broken childhood, and the burden of fame she never sought. In 1995, she ended her life at the age of 25. These were not just the dark sides of fame. They were real fractures in Brando's heart, wounds no Oscar could ever heal. As a father, he was powerless. As a man once surrounded by love affairs, he could not hold peace within his own home. With age, his once vital body was ravaged by diabetes, liver cancer, pulmonary fibrosis, and congestive heart failure. Brando withdrew into a private world, avoiding cameras, premieres, and all the noise of the spotlight. Yet even in seclusion, he could not escape the ghosts of his past. fame loss, pain, and the quiet persistence of bad choices. On July 1st, 2004, Marlon Brando died at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles at the age of 80. There was no grand farewell, no lavish memorial. His ashes were scattered in two places: Tahiti, where he had loved fiercely, and Death Valley, where he had found peace. One a symbol of his passion for life, the other a final stillness. Both deeply private, like the man himself. Brando never wanted to be a role model. He never demanded to be worshipped. But through a life of contradictions, rebellious and raw, he reshaped ideas about masculinity, fame, and identity. He dared to live honestly, even when that truth was jagged. He dared to love, even when that love defied every convention. There was no farewell tour, no final film, no grand speech. Brando left this world the way he lived, quietly, defiantly. His story did not end with applause, but with a pause. And strangely enough, that felt right. Brando had never followed the rules. Not in cinema, not in love, and not in goodbye. In a life marked by both men and women, Marlon Brando's lovers, from James Dean and Wally Cox to women from Asia and Africa, remain a question: was it a bold declaration of sexual freedom, or just an endless search for a love he never truly held? What do you think? Leave your comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to discover more untold stories behind legendary figures. Because sometimes what defines them is not the moments on stage, but the scars they've hidden all their lives.